Добрый день, дорогие друзья. Я Влад Волков, Винотерра. У нас сегодня замечательный день, потому что мы можем провести интервью с легендарным австрийским виноделом. И не только с легендарным виноделом, но еще и с известнейшим специалистом по истории виноделия и винным философом из легендарного хозяйства Schloss Gobelsburg. Сегодня у нас будет интервью с Михаэлем Мосбрюгером. И, надеюсь, нам всем будет интересно. So, thank you so much for being here and being ready to tell us your story. So, could you please tell us how it happened that you started to be a winemaker and you got in your hands one of the, I would say, World Heritage estates, wine estates?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's... I always say, it was a coincidence that I was able to take over the responsibility for Schloss Gobelsburg. On the other side, as I am connected with Cistercian monks from Burgundy, they have a different attitude towards that question. So they say, there is no luck and no coincidence. So, it shows that it's always a question of perspective, how you turn it. Now, Schloss Gobelsburg is a very historical place. It's the settlement starts here at 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. It was always settled throughout Roman times, Middle Ages, and used to be a classical fortress in the 11th century, was then transferred into a Renaissance castle, and then in the mid-18th century was turned to a Baroque castle, how it looks today. So a very typical expression of Austrian construction culture in the Baroque and Rococo times. And the estate is connected to a Cistercian monastery because the owner in the 12th century founded in the 12th century a Cistercian monastery about half an hour north from the today's estate, and gave the monks then in 1171 their first vineyards, and that's the reason why we celebrated 850 years 2 years ago, and been celebrating actually the monastic winemaking of these days. I'm personally coming originally from the hotel and restaurant trade. So my family runs a 5-star hotel in the skiing areas of Austria, and so my background is sommelier and restaurant business. But when my brother took over the responsibilities at the family business, I decided to go into the growing areas of Austria because my father was the founder of the first Austrian Sommelier Association. So wine was always an important issue in our family life, and therefore I decided then to go into Niederösterreich, made my apprenticeship, and then I was looking for a possibility. And that was the moment when I had the possibility to take over the responsibilities for the estate.
Since you've got in your hands the really unique object that combines specific natural conditions, really long history, and definitely a great potential. So how does it feel, to keep in your mind all this responsibility, your obligations, your targets, your desires, your dream? How do you feel about, how could you explain what is your feeling and what is your inspiration in terms of this?
Well, Schloss Gobelsburg is definitely a very specific estate in Austria. It's one of the oldest estates of Austria, and probably it's one of the representatives of Austrian history and culture of wine. And in that perspective, an estate is, like Gobelsburg, is not something that you would define as something where you can show your own personality. It's rather something that you have to serve, this cultural identity. And when you ask for inspiration, I think this is one of the big differences, to family estates. In a family estate, the most important thing is the personality of the winemaker. And also maybe the personality of the family, let's put it like this. And all decisions are always made according to this personality and the values that this family is representing. And this is completely different in an estate like Gobelsburg, because in an estate like Gobelsburg, you are more like a custodian to that place. You have to look after it, you have the responsibility, and you have the responsibility to bring it into the next generation. And that's in my eyes very important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you actually took a very different approach, and that's the difference that you just explained right now. And your research in what was happening in the state before, and the way that you started to produce your wines, or let's say that they were there was an evolution since you took the estate. So what was your reason to go completely opposite way of all the other producers, to recuperate the historical winemaking techniques and all this?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the biggest challenges in the world today is that we have so many options. When you're studying the historical realities of winemakers 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, here winemakers were much more defined actually by circumstances and by the possibilities that were offered to them in terms of tools that were available, in terms of collective ideas about wine, about the collective idea about the culture of producing wine, and so on. Nowadays, producers have all possibilities, which allows them to go very opposite ways. You can in a big playground, you have now all options. The big problem starts when you pose the question, what kind of orientation can you get in all these possibilities? There is, for winemakers, you have different possibilities of thinking and attitude. And I think it's, of course, we have all these possibilities, so a lot of people are using different possibilities, or they're producing all of these possibilities. It's a very Germanistic attitude, because it's an attitude that it's always posing to my possibilities. If you bring if you have a vineyard in Germany, winemakers very often are following the idea to pose the question, what options do I have now, to produce wine out of this specific vineyard? This is, of course, it's an attitude that you can play, because then you can say, okay, I make now a selection of this, I can make a selection of that, I can plant different grape varieties, and it's interesting. You say, okay, it's interesting, and I say, yes, it is interesting, but how long is it interesting? And the big question is that, if you are going away and if you're searching for something, then I think it's great to search for something, but at the end you have to find something. And this is something that I am sourcing actually out of our history and of our traditions. This is why I'm reading all these papers about the historical developments, about studying, how our predecessors have been working, because it's, at the end of the day, it's the fundament of our area. And this source, is so rich in my eyes that we have an obligation, actually, to follow this idea. And it brings me to a point to develop a very clear vision, of what I want to achieve and in which direction I want to go. And it's liberating in a way from all modern trends and from all these streamings, because trends are often, of course, it's a search, but it's not always a finding, And so this is what I want to show, and this is what I think that where I have an obligation, actually also towards the whole industry, to say, okay, we can play around, but, this is our history, this is our tradition, and this is where we need to go.
Okay, then more specific question, because you had released a few years ago a very, in the eyes of many, a very revolutionary new wines, because everybody thinks, as you just explained before, that like the highest end of the wines in Germanic winemaking culture is single vineyard, single vintage, single variety wine normally. And you went completely opposite, multi-vintage blends, and many people think that this is some kind of revolution, and I believe that you more see that as going back to the roots in a way. And so how could you explain that?
Well, when I took over the responsibilities at Gobelsburg, I studied first the history of the estate, of the monks and all the developments of the past 850 years. But I very soon started actually to occupy also on the question on the history of winemaking. So the question of how did the Romans the Greek Romans made wine, how was wine made in the Middle Ages, in the 14th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and all these developments. And therefore I decided in 2001 to go for a project that is related to the early 19th century winemaking. So the time period between the French Revolution and the mid of the 19th century, because it's a period that on one side is looking back to an empirical knowledge of 2000 years of winemaking. On the other side, it's a period that is not yet influenced by all the questions of industrialization. So it's starting around 1850 that winemakers and scientists are posing the very classical industrial question: how can we produce wine in bigger quantities and in a shorter period of time? And the result was some technological innovations. For example, in 1850 are coming the first filtration machines, then new pressing systems are invented, pumping machines, electrification of the cellars, and all these innovations have been starting to change the craftsmanship side of winemakers. And together with the change of the craftsmanship side of winemaking, also attitudes were starting to change. So the ideas about wine and what is wine, how we see wine, and all these questions is something that started over the next 150 years to change and is ending up to what we are recalling today as the modern wine world. Now, the modern wine world sees wine in many different ways, but you know what you find in many fine winemakers' minds, or when you're talking to a lot of fine winemakers around the world, then the principal attitude is an anti-authoric idea. Which means that great wine is made in the vineyard, but not in the cellar. The art of making great wine is to do nothing. Yeah. So it's if you compare it to child education, it's an anti-authoric idea about winemaking process. This used to be 200 years ago completely different, because the whole self side of winemakers and how winemakers have been looking to themselves and in their relation to the wines was completely different. It was rather they were rather following the idea that wine is something that would be comparable to us as human beings. They said wine is like us. And in the same way that we as humans, when we are born, have to undergo certain developments until we are grown-ups, also wine has to undergo certain developments until he comes to his maturity. And in the same way as we have to breathe to do all these developments, also wine has to breathe. So the principal idea was to let the wine breathe in regular time, in order to trigger all these developments that are leading then to the maturity of the wine. So it's a kind of a comparison. Winemakers have seen themselves as cellar masters, yeah? And the wine was basically, you know, a kind of a pupil, you know. So they have been seen themselves as a teacher. So they have been talking about the teaching of the wine, or in French, élevage. In German, die Schulung. So you see that here you suddenly have a completely different relationship, because my responsibility as a cellar master is to identify the potentials of a wine and to educate him right, that he would develop at some stage up to his potential. Now, I think that this is a project and a speciality that we do at Schloss Gobelsburg, because we, on one side, believe that we are an estate that has a responsibility to express the 21st century. On the other side, we also have a responsibility to not completely forget what our predecessors have been doing in the past. So, even though that the tradition wines are widely discussed and are taken as a great fine wine in a way, we see it as still not as the main attention of our work. You know, so even though that it's a very special product and we really enjoy doing it and we see it as a responsibility, but still, you know, the typical wines of appellations are still the center of what we are doing. And this is our responsibility as an estate. We are a part of winemaking of the 21st century, and we have the responsibility to find the true expression of the 21st century. Tradition is something that is, you know, is meant for people who are very into the fine wine, who know already a lot about the wines of appellation, the typical wines of the areas and all that. And for people who want to compare and have an intellectual approach, you know, towards all these questions when it comes to historical and all these processes. And besides, of course, it also teaches us something. You know, it teaches us certain aspects of what is modern, what is tradition, what is historical, what is accurate. I think it's also important for our team, you know, to occupy on all these questions, because it positioning yourself, you know, in a different perspective in the context of the modern world.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. And talking about more about all over Austria, because I know that the appellation system is developing since like early 2000s. And what is like a global concept now? Because I know that in TV you have classification since years or decades already. What will be the development? If it will be the system for all the areas, how it's going to be developing now?
Well, you know, the Austrian culture of wine was born out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you can say that if you look into the history until the 1960s, the biggest part of wine in Austria was sold as village wine. So the biggest part of wine was sold by the names of the villages, and these villages had a quite clear definition of their stylistical expression. So if someone was ordering a Gumbolzkirchner, then everyone knew, okay, this will be a richer wine, lower acidity, more rounder structure. If someone was ordering a Brunner Straßle, it would be an acidic-driven wine. If someone was ordering Langenlois Gobelsburg Krems wine, then he would get probably something more spicy or something in this direction. Now, so the styles of the villages were quite clearly defined, not by law, but by the culture of eating and drinking, and by the tools that were available in these days, to the winemakers, and beside also by the basement of the field blend that existed in these days, because field blend was an evolutionary project. Field blend is not, which is different today, because a field blend today is rather an artificial concept. But in these days, field blend used to be an evolutionary outcome of a development of many hundreds of years. So because certain grape varieties at a certain point, develop better than others, and so it's like in the fauna and in nature. When you have a hill and you're going from west to south to east, then you find different flowers, on the different positionings, and so on. So it was a very natural concept. Now, in the 1960s, in Austria, the transformation to single varietal planting happened. This development was delayed out of several reasons. It's a development that in France and in Germany took place together with phylloxera. In Austria, it happened in the 1960s, and so for the next 50 years, people have been selling the wines after grape variety. So Grüner Veltliner became very important as a kind of a varietal brand for Austria that was linked to the Austrian culture of wine. This is a concept that worked quite well for a certain amount of time. However, we realized that on the long run, it will be important that we are establishing appellations in the vineyards of Austria. Now, this is the reason why in 2000s we started to develop the first appellations for Austria. After 20 years, we can say now all the appellations are existing. However, we are still under construction. So you can criticize that maybe. On the other side, I have to say, an appellation system in the world of today is not something that you can create from one day to another. You need time, you need adjustments and all that. So it's maybe not in every sense perfect, but what we see is that we are moving more and more to a clear structure in Austria. So this is something that we can recognize. So we are moving more and more that all appellations are going to the 3-tier system. So this is now one achievement. So the wines of the regions, the wines of the villages, the wines of the single vineyards. So this is structure-wise, I think, a big advantage, when we have all appellations now in one structure. Another aspect that we are looking to, and that is now connected to österreichische Traditionsweingüter. Österreichische Traditionsweingüter, or the traditional wineries of Austria, ÖTW, is an association that was founded in 1991 by a small group of producers in the Kammtal and Kremstal. And they already defined at that stage that their ambition is to establish a vineyard classification system for the vineyards of Austria. Now, it's we cannot go too much now into details, but the question is, why would you do something like this? Now, and you have to consider that in the early 90s, the big heroes on the wine market were Bordeaux.
Yeah.
So something that is completely different to a vineyard classification system. Burgundy in the 90s was existing. Some geeks, were occupying on Burgundy, but it was rather recalled as unreliable, very difficult, not something, that you would consider as something that you would go for. Yeah. So, however, they said, we want to go for a vineyard classification. Now, appellations have advantages and disadvantages. An appellations are the most democratic and the most social way of selling wine. So this is why we believe in appellations, because in a society of producers, it's very important, to have the social aspect on one side, and it's also important to find a collective idea about the expression of wine. So this is why I think that appellations are very important for a society of producers. And especially when you're looking to the Austrian vineyard structure, where you have a very fractional situation. Every single vineyard is divided by 30, 40, 50 different producers. So 3 rows, one producer, 6 rows, another producer, and so on. So it's highly complicated. And in that context, I think it's very important, to have these appellations. Now, the disadvantage for appellations is the smaller origin gets, the higher is the number that you have on the market. When we are talking about 18 appellations in Austria, but when we're going to the village level, we are already talking about 900 names.
Whoa.
Yeah? When we're going then to the level of the single vineyards, we're talking about 5,000 names that appear on the market. So this is a problem, and especially a problem on an international level. Because, these are all German names, many languages, it's difficult, all these German expressions and all that. And this is now what our French colleagues realized already 200 years ago, that in a very complex environment, when you have so many different names that people cannot remember, it's a huge advantage, to have an orientation system like a classification, because it's always easier to communicate a class and a category of wines than all the names that are implemented in this category. Yeah? And this is the big advantage actually about classification, and is limiting, the disadvantage of an appellation system, and is helping the whole segment in the industry, from the producer to an importer, the communication from the importer to the sommelier, the communication from the sommelier to the consumer and to the guest. So in the whole line, it's a help on the communication side. And this is something that the founding members realized from the very beginning. Now, in a country like Austria, of course, in the beginning, it was seen skeptically, because, if you don't have any experience, with the topic, and farmers are always very conservative, because because if you don't know what the change and what the results out of these changes are, then you're very cautious. So in the beginning, ministry and the wine politicians were very restrictive in that question. However, we developed a system that allowed us to evaluate, the status of the vineyard on an objective level. So this is the first thing. On the other thing was that more than 10 years ago, there was an expert group was founded by the Austrian National Committee, Wine Committee, and we were leading for about 7 years the question of how can we bring the ÖTV classification into the legislation. So 2 years ago, the first legislation text was defined, it was written down, and it was just now in July 2023 that the minister signed the law for the legislation of the classification for Austria. Now, we already have the first messages and the first journals who have been writing. Austria is now the first country outside of France that has achieved, to define a legal classification for their vineyards. And even though that it will now take a few years, to establish the classification, I think it's a big step in the overall development for Austria. And I'm coming now back to the question that you have been posing. What does it mean now for Austria and the structure? I think it's a very important step. A country and a culture of wine like Austria needs a clear concept. It needs a clear structure for the communication. And I think that Austria will make a big step through the classification, because the communication for everyone in the world is getting much, much clearer now. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, one of the biggest advantages, and this is where I see actually, the future of Austrian wine.
Okay, and another thing is that I just, of course, since I know Austrian wine since a long time, sometimes I have questions to the appellations, like, for example, Weinviertel, mm-hmm. Is defined only for Grüne Veltliner. Mm-hmm. And if you will look at the area, it's very big, it's very wide, and it has different traditions inside. Mm-hmm. So some of the areas more for Burgundy varieties, the other for Riesling. Mm-hmm. So do you think one day it's going to happen that they will have several appellations, or like generic and more specified? And will they open the door for the other grape varieties that are also traditional for the area?
I'm very sure about this, and they're already leading these discussions. So Weinviertel will be an area that will go first of all to the 3-tier system, and there will be they have to change, the question. The thing is that when it comes to the discussion of appellations, I think that nowadays. One of the most discussed question is always the grape varieties. And I personally see the grape variety as the most unimportant thing about appellations. Why is that? When it comes to appellations, the most important thing, and here I'm coming back now to the Germanistic idea and the Romanistic idea about making wine. So the Germanistic idea asking for the possibilities that I have as a winemaker to produce wine out of a specific vineyard. Now, how is the positioning of a Romanistic winemaker, in that question? So if a French winemaker has a vineyard, he's not posing the question, what are my possibilities? He's posing the question, out of all my possibilities that I have, what is the most typical expression of this vineyard?
Yeah.
So this is the big question, and that is leading now philosophically, automatically into an appellation system, because an appellation system is not posing the question about grape varieties; it's posing the question of typicity, and which means that a collective in an area has to ask themselves. What is happening, and what wine should be in the bottle, and what wine should a consumer can expect if a winemaker is writing in big letters Kamptal or Weinviertel on his label? This is the crucial question. So first of all, the process is you have to ask yourself, okay, I'm making a wine that is called now Weinviertel. Now, what stylistical expression should this wine be? Yeah? So then you can make a definition, about style, etc., and so on. Winemaking. If you look into, the French appellations, they have been exactly, putting down, how they make wine from the vineyard into the cellar. That's basically the appellation laws of France, because in these days. Anyhow, everyone has been doing the same. So what have they been doing? They have been just writing down what they actually did. So how did they treat the vineyards? How are the wines trained? How do you cut them and so on? How do you treat them in the cellar? What grape varieties do we have in the vineyards? And you see, In Châteauneuf, the first appellation in France, we have 13 different grape varieties.
Yeah.
No one is discussing about this, you know. Now, when people thinking about appellations, they always think about Burgundy, you know, where you have only one for white and one for red. Of course, you know, it has some advantages, you know, if you have only one grape variety, but it's not, you know, it's not that you say, okay, an appellation has to have only one grape variety, and then we find a style out of that. No, it's the other way around. First, you have to define the style and how you produce it, and then you can pose the question, what grape varieties are able to represent that specific style? And this is actually, you know, what I'm always telling them, you have to make it the other way around, you know. Weinviertel is not Grüner Veltliner. Weinviertel is a specific style that you can expect, you know, when you buy a certain bottle of wine. And this is the most important aspect. Yes, Weinviertel will change. They have to.
Okay, great. Okay, then the other question that people discuss a lot, mentioning fine wines, is terroir. What is terroir for you, and how do you see your way to express terroir in your wines?
Well, terroir is a term that no one really can define actually what it is. You know, I mean, of course, I mean the first association that comes to the term is the type of soil that you have in front of you. It's the climatical situation that you have in front of you. But I think terroir is a little bit more than that. You know, I think terroir is implementing also tradition and history, and of course culture. And I think that terroir is certainly one aspect that is defining wine, but I think it's not enough. You know, I think that winemakers in the past 20, 30 years have a little been overdoing, you know, this term of terroir in the same way as they have been overdoing the importance of geology. You know, of course, we all like to talk about geology, and in the meantime, all winemakers are more or less hobby geologists. But I think it's a little bit exaggerated. You know, I think that we need to be a little bit cautious, you know, to not overdo the whole terroir and geology thing a little bit, you know, too much, because wine is a cultural product, you know, and it's a cultural product, and it's implemented in the term of agriculture, you know. So which means that it's coming from a farmer's idea, and it's implementing not only growing but also the cultural aspect. And we all know that, you know, when it comes to the wine and to the expression of wine, there are so many aspects that are implemented in you know, what's coming out, that we cannot reduce, you know, the personality of a wine to just only one aspect. It's more like a chain of 100 pieces, you know, and every piece, you know, has a certain meaning, you know, to the total, you know. And it's giving song, and so you cannot reduce a chain to just one part of it. Yeah? Sure. So I think that first of all, you have genetics. I mean, you have the genetic of the plant, and the genetic of the plant is something that, in the same way as we have our genes as humans, is something that is given to you. And now the question is, you know, where you put these genes into it. You know, so here, of course, the different soil and the climatical situation is coming into the game. Because, and this is because, you know, when it comes to geology, there's a big misunderstanding, because a lot of people believe that the minerals in the soil are transported actually into the grapes, and then they are expressed in the wine. We made actually with Maria Heinrich, that we made scientific researches actually on the question, and there's nothing whatsoever is coming from that. The functionality is completely different. It's compare it to us as humans, let's say if you have a certain musicality, Now the question is, in what kind of family you are born? Are you born into a family where everyone is playing an instrument and they're singing all the time and so on, or you go to a school where they're doing a lot of music? Your talent, is elevated. On the other side, if you're coming into a family where nothing of that is happening, your talent will probably not develop. And the same is happening for wines. If you have a certain predomination for a certain aromatical profile, then it depends actually, on your circumstances, on the soil and the climatical situation. If the aromatics are developing more into this direction or a little bit more in this direction. So this is the altering, of the components. But whatever the development of this is, and also in the conjunction then with different vintages and all that, it's a very complex system.
Absolutely.
However, then you have decisions of humans around you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that means it depends, on how the winemaker and the wine grower is treating the soil. Is he planting other plants there, or is he keeping it open? Is he trying, to bring more insects there? How is he treating, the plant, grape protection? All these questions, all they have an influence. And then you have the question: when are you going to harvest? Are you harvesting early? Are you harvesting late? It all has influences,
Yeah, a few passages, for example.
So, as what I want to say, so you can go on and on and on and on. So there are so many aspects, and all of them have an influence of what you have then in the glass. Every glass is a history, and is the outcome of 100 decisions, that we are doing for the vineyard, the wines, and so on. And so I think we cannot reduce, the question of terroir and geology, as the only source, of interpretation.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's a part of it, but it's not everything. And then, so I think this is now the more or less clear part, But what interests me actually the most, in that conceptual framework, is what a society of producers, is what kind of culture, within a society is playing in that role in the decision making. Because the thing is that, we as wine growers, we are not alone, we have neighbors. We see what our neighbors are doing, and we're discussing it. One neighbor is doing something very crazy or very different. Then we're discussing it. Then we think well, we should try it out because it brings us success, or maybe we say he's stupid, all these discussions we're tasting together, one of us is, very successful with what he is doing and all these questions. But here, this is, here it's getting really interesting, what this cultural context, this collective working of society, how this is affecting, the way how we treat our vineyards. We see it, I see it already, between Kamptal and Wachau, for example, I see a significant difference on how we discuss with each other between the different areas. And this is we're talking about 15 minutes by car, and you see that society has a certain influence already, in the process actually and this is something that we also have to take in account, you know, in the contextual concept of terroir and everything that is connected.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because I really think when I teach students in the sommelier schools, I always mention them that if there will be no humans, the wine will stay in the wild nature, and there will be no wine. The grape will be fermented probably inside and picked by the birds.
Exactly.
That's it.
Yeah. Exactly.
So to me, the human and the wine making tradition and culture and society is a part of terroir, actually, and that defines everything. Okay. About the fine wines, your definition. So you mentioned already a few times fine wines. That is something that we are also discussing in between our team a lot, because we feel that the producers we work with some kind belong to this area. So what is fine wine for you, and how do you see the way that you get there to become a fine winemaker?
Fine wine is probably a definition that is not really made by winemakers, rather by the wine market, I would say.
Or wine trade.
And the wine trade. It's pointing out, you know, that there is a difference between the kind of a mass market or a kind of standard wines and something that is special to people, or let's say special to a very specific segment of consumers. So basically for people who have a higher understanding about the world of wine and have a higher appreciation when it comes to wine and wine consumption. And then there's also, of course, there's a monetary aspect not really involved in the whole thing, because normally we're talking about wines that are very sought after and where people are willing actually to pay higher prices actually for these wines in comparison to ordinary wines or standard wines. Yeah. Maybe fine wines for us as wine producers is maybe also a concept of attitude. So which means that also for us as winemakers, we have something that is kind of easily to be produced in our circumstances. And then there are things that are difficult to produce. Where we have to make more efforts, actually, you know, to achieve it, where the effort to create something special is very high and very demanding and very resourceful. So this is probably in the context of a wine producer something that we maybe also call a noble wine, you know, something that is beyond the standard. But I think when people are talking about fine wine, it's probably rather something that is rather born out of the wine trade rather than from the producer's side. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, the question is about your interest in the other wines, not from your own winery, let's say. So if there will be an option to start a new project somewhere, where would you go? And also, which wines are you normally interested in? Which wines do you follow? And maybe what is kept in your cellar for your personal pleasure?
Well, I mean, being responsible for an estate with such a long history, when it comes to other wines outside of Schloss Gobelsburg, I have a deep interest actually in the in the most prominent wine styles of the 19th century. So I organized a seminar or a symposium on the most important wine styles of the 19th century a few years ago, and so we were discussing the wine styles of Jerez, of Madeira, of Rioja. At that time, I also wanted to implement the Jura. We had Tokai, and so the big question was, I mean, what do these old wine styles, what do they mean for us today? And in what context can we see them? So I think, and this is something that I'm still, trying to study. My wife and I, we have a great love for Madeira, for Jerez, for the old wine styles of Rioja, for Jura. So it's something that that we have a close look at, and then of course we also have a look to Bordeaux, to Burgundy, to Alsace, to Germany, to the different. We are very lucky to have a lot of friends actually, in all of these areas, and it's a great privilege, to be able to discuss all these questions on an enjoyable level on one side, but also on an intellectual level. I think it's important. But what brings for me, all these questions are going at the end always into the same directions. I think it's the question of what is my responsibility as a winemaker in my area. And this is, I think, one of the crucial questions of the world of wine today, because what I see many wine producers and also many friends who are trying to copy other wine styles.
Yeah.
And this is something where I'm very skeptical about,
Absolutely.
We all know Burgundy is now highly sought after, and a lot of winemakers love the wine style of Burgundy. And what they do is then they start to try to make wines that taste a little bit the same as Burgundy, or maybe are identical with wine.
Mm-hmm.
I just recently, a few weeks ago, I tasted a wine from Germany, from Rheinhessen. And we had a Meursault just on the side, and the wines tasted identical. And the thing is that what it tells us that it is possible, because a certain wine style also in Burgundy, is a little bit fashionable, the reductive, flinty style, and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's, a lot of people always believed, this is true terroir, And I tell you, it's nothing than winemaking. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm very skeptical about all these approaches because, what is my responsibility as a winemaker? And what is the beauty about wine? I mean, when I'm studying all the wine styles from the different countries, I do it because I appreciate the different wine styles. I don't want that everything is the same.
Their uniqueness.
Exactly. I'm talking about the authentic expression of an area. And this is where I see my responsibility, and this is also where I see my responsibility as the president of the association Österreichische Traditionsweingüter, to point out our responsibility is not to make perfect copies of Burgundy. Our responsibility is to find an expression that is unique for the Danube area. So this is what we have to aim for,
Yeah.
So it's, we have achieved our goal if in a blind tasting you can say, okay, this must be Burgundy, this must be Germany, and this must be Danube region, If we come to this point, then we did something right. And this is what this is what I'm fighting for. This is what I stand for. This is what I'm preaching. I think this is the only possibility on the long run, to establish, this country on the international side.
It's very interesting because it looks like it's a kind of, the élevage of the wine culture. Because I remember that was it late 90s when in UK they did a blind tasting with the Austrian Chardonnays and Gewürztraminer and Burgundy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at that time, I think it was seen by everybody as a great victory. And now you understand that this actually, it was just one step to believe more in your own wines.
Yeah. No, and I have to say, I always said, even though that this tasting helped the Austrian wine industry a lot and gave a lot of attention, but it was always comparing apples to pears, and I discussed it also, with an Austrian journalist, because I said, how come that these guys did not recognize a Burgundy wine and an Austrian wine? It's impossible.
I have an idea. Yeah, because I think that in the late 90s, the idea of the greatest wines, even in Burgundy, was ripeness. And the Gewürztraminer can be looking like sometimes in reserve style like a Chardonnay, but extremely ripe Chardonnay with lower acidities. Yeah. So that's why this is my just idea or my guess, that they just seen that as a really, like very warm, ripe Burgundy.
I think, and probably some of the tasters were not so much experienced actually in Austrian wines.
Absolutely,
and they probably didn't know very much actually about Austrian wines. And they were then, and at that point, they were so charmed, by maybe the expression of the Danube region or these wines that it turned out, to be the result. I think it's, it's an historical. It's an historical thing that of course made a big impact actually in the further developments. However, this is something that I'm very strict about. That Austria needs, to have a very clear idea about the typical expression, of their origins and their appellations.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean certain grape varieties, I believe, right? Because
exactly. Yeah.
Because what they're going to do in the Steiermark,
exactly.
They have only Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and to me, I think it's the greatest achievement that they can get. That people in the blind tasting would say this Sauvignon Blanc comes from Styria and not from anywhere else.
Exactly. Yeah.
The question about sparkling wines, because I'm also asking myself many times. It will be interesting. What do you think about it? When you make or your colleagues making sparkling wines outside of champagne, I think they're all struggling because whatever they do, they will be compared with champagne and most probably will lose in this comparison. Not because of the wine is worse or better, but because of the stereotype thinking of the consumers and sommeliers too, that nothing can be as good as champagne. So when you produce your sparkling wine, what is your attitude to that, and actually what you think about producing your sparkling wines?
First of all, historically we have an old history in sparkling production. So this is the reason why we make sparkling wine. And the second reason is that Langenlois, so the village where we are located in, became in the past 20-30 years the epicenter of quality sparkling production in Austria. So for some unknown reason, we have a high concentration of high quality producers here in this village, and therefore within the context of Austrian wine production, we suddenly got a link, between a name of origin and a certain production method, which is a little bit unusual. So it's something that you find, for example, outside of Champagne with Franciacorta, and you have maybe a few other examples. But in Austria, in the context of the Austrian wine industry, Langenlois became the identity of quality sparkling production. So this is why we got more and more also demand from that side, and this is why we also started to produce more different cuvées, which is leading already now to a certain culture. So here it's not a singularity expression, or a winemaker says, okay, he wants to, but it's rather something that is born out of a cultural development. Yeah? So this is one aspect. Another aspect is when my attitude, and that's related to the last question that we were discussing. My attitude is that we have very high production standards. So this is something that is basically born out of the possibilities and production possibilities actually that we have in our area. On the other side, I have never been trying actually to make copies. And in the same way as I believe that it's important for the Danube area to develop its own wine style, I think it's also important to develop for the sparkling wines as very specific styles of Austria. That is the reason why I've never been using to a major extent Burgundy grapes, like in Champagne. And I've been rather trying, to make the basic expression of the autochthone grape varieties of Austria. Grüner Veltliner, Welschriesling, Riesling. So these are the major grape varieties, also Zweigelt. So these are the major grape varieties of Austria. And trying, to work on that basement, trying to find a stylistic expression that is working, to a specific expression for Austrian sparkling wine. Now, I think, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Champagne is seen as the leader in that field, and I have a great appreciation of what my colleagues are doing. We are talking about 37,000 hectares of wine that is produced only sparkling production, or close to everything, sparkling production. And it's a fantastic culture, it's a fantastic history, and there is nothing said to be about it. But I think when you're looking to the overall developments in the world and also in the fine wine business, you see more and more that people are looking for more diversity. So when they say, okay, we want to have a sparkling, it's not only Champagne anymore. So when you're looking to high quality sparkling, you already find some very good alternatives, which allows you, to now and then to switch over maybe to something different, which is enhancing, the cultural aspect of sparkling production. You find more and more bars that are specializing on sparkling wines, and they are offering not only Champagne, they are offering sparkling wines from all around the world.
Absolutely.
And I see, and I think that we have in that niche, I think there is a justification actually, on the sparkling production. And I think if Langenlois, has already a name and an identification, with that kind of production, then I think it's offering, a possibility.
Great. Probably the last one is about the climate change. And
Okay.
how do you see that? I mean, can be 2 hours by itself, I think, right? But do you, obviously, I believe you see the changes in the climate. And so what is your reaction and how do you see the perspectives in terms of wine growing in Kamstal?
There is, of course, climate change. I think there is nothing to discuss about it. You can, of course, always discuss it, how severe it is, how dramatically it is. It depends a little bit on the perspective. It depends on how full or half empty you see the glass. It depends on judgments. What do you think where things are going? And honestly, we are very often currently asked about this question. But I have to say it's not an easy answer to give, and a good easy answer to give, and a very short answer to give. Because what is the problem? The problem is that if you look into it scientifically, then we can say, for example, looking to the flowering dates of the past 50 years, then you clearly see that you get a graph that is going up and down and up and down and up and down. Yeah? So if you're calculating a tendency line through all this data, then you clearly see that the flowering is getting earlier, which is a direct indication for climate change. Yeah? But the big question is, what is the consequence for us as winemakers? Because the thing is, you have to consider, we as winemakers, we are living not in the statistics, we're living in a current reality. And what is our current reality? The current reality is that we have early years, middle years, late years. Yeah? And at that point, I have to say that in late years, we are harvesting until the end of November. So this is a late year. An early year means that we are harvesting until the first week of November. This is an early year. So this is a warm year. So the hottest year that we ever had in the past 200 years was 2003. And we were harvesting until the first week of November. And that's already now 20 years ago. Yeah? So now the thing is that our responsibility as a winemaker, we cannot do anything according to a statistic. We can only do things according to our current reality. That means that if it's warm, we have to make proper decisions according that it's warmer. If it's cool, like this year, then we have to make according decisions that it's a cool year. And if it's raining a lot, then we have to make a proper decision according that it's raining a lot. And if we have no water, then we have to make a proper decision that we have no water. So that means, and this is one of the interesting aspects to be a winemaker, on one side, we have a long-term perspective. When we plant a vineyard, we are planting it for the next 30, 50, 60 years. But on the other side, we're living in a very short period of time. Which means that, we're living, in the time frame, we can see to the future maybe for 7 to 14 days, approximately. And we have to make daily decisions, actually, for our wines, for our vineyards. And so that means that we are always living, just on the moment, And, that contradictionary aspect, that's really interesting. Also in the perspective, of climate change. We see, some phenomenons, but if you look into history, these phenomenons have always been here. We experienced always hail, we always experienced floodings, we always experienced dry periods, and so on. Of course, and if you want to be populistic, then you're claiming in 20 years there will be no Grüne Veltliner anymore and we will only make Cabernet. honestly,
or Carignan?
okay, I don't believe in it. Honestly, I think that the Danube region is, first of all, is a valley situation, which means, you know, that a valley, the more you go up in the valleys, the more you gain in altitude. So let's say it's getting warmer. The only consequence will be that winemaking will be possible in higher altitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? But we will still be working up to the limits, you know. So it's so the thing is that we always be a white wine producing area because we are working in an area where we're going up to the limits.
Okay.
And that is you know, one of the most important aspects for at least for the next generation, and then the next generation has to evaluate the current situation.
Yeah. Okay, so I can ask you more and more questions. We can talk for hours, but there are always a limit. So thank you so much. It was extremely interesting, and so I will say a few words to the audience. And thank you so much for this interview.
Okay. Thank you.
Что ж, друзья, с Михаэлем можно разговаривать часами, всегда это очень интересно. Надеемся, что мы задали ему интересные для вас вопросы. И увидимся на следующих интервью. С вами был Влад Волков, Винотерра, Михаэль Мосбрюгер, Schloss Gobelsburg. До следующих встреч. Пока.